Bukharin was the leading Bolshevik economist. A popular man, his humane policies posed a major threat to Stalin, and their complex relationship dominated Russian politics in the 20s and 30s. Bukharin finally fell victim to a brutal regime of terror, which greatly marked the lives of all those, Russian and foreign alike, who lived through it. One man who was deeply affected by both Bukharin and Stalin was Sir Fitzroy MacLean. He arrived in Moscow in 1937 as a junior diplomat posted to the British Embassy.
I remember the first time I arrived in Moscow at this station. It was a gloomy February afternoon, dark, snow everywhere, crowds on the streets, all huddled in their sheepskin. Not a very cheerful outlook. The only thing that livened the scene up a bit was unexpectedly a state funeral which held up the car. This was the funeral of Johnny Kidzey, an important member of the party and government who died suddenly. We only realized afterwards that the reason why he died, Stalin, who was an old friend of his, had found him a problem and had decided to get rid of him. But as he was an old friend, he gave him the choice of a firing squad and no funeral, or suicide and a state funeral, and he very sensibly chose the latter. One of the horrible things about the terror was the suspicion that it generated right through life, public and private life alike. Suspicion hung over Moscow and the whole Soviet Union like a poisonous mist seeping in everywhere. It reached right into the life of every family. You never knew who would denounce you. It could be your closest friend, it could be your closest relative, your own children or own parents.
In a remarkable turnaround, Mikhail Gorbachev has denounced the Stalin era and confronted the Russian people with the reality of their past. For the first time, Stalin, once the revered and adored national leader, is being reappraised by the Soviet authorities, and the stagnant bureaucracy which he established is being dismantled. Thousands of people who disappeared or were murdered in the 30s have been rehabilitated. In February 1988, Gorbachev declared Bukharin's trial rigged and the evidence falsified. He restored Bukharin's party membership, annulled his sentence, and declared the state guilty of his murder. People are now able to ask, was there an alternative to Stalinism? And some are saying, yes, the policies of Nikolai Bukharin.
It's extremely difficult until this year to obtain any realistic and reliable information about Bukharin, simply because he was erased from the history books for half a century. But he's now become an object of intense interest amongst Moscow intellectuals, many of the older of whom are coming forward with memories of having worked with him in editorial offices, or even at earlier stages with him in the party apparatus. Thus, at last, we're beginning to get a picture of the man. The common denominator in all the pictures we've had so far is that he was found delightful and charming by all those who met him.
One must remember that he was a young intellectual. He was 29 years old when the revolution happened. He was a revolutionary romantic, and for a revolutionary romantic, a real revolution is a wonderful thing. He imagined that the world could be rapidly transformed into communism, and he was one of the so-called left communists, one of those who were particularly given to utopian dreams at that time. For a long time, mixed economy, very slow movement to socialism. Yes, of course, industrialization, but not too fast, at the speed that the market-based relationship with the peasants can bear. Of course, you can tax them, but not too much. After all, you mustn't use force. This is his great contribution. The revolution was the use of force, of course. Coercion, he was in favor of the terror during the revolution. After the revolution, this is a workers' and peasant state, the further movement should be peaceful and should not, so to speak, be determined by the drastic use of coercion and the police. This is where, of course, he parted company later with Stalin.
Bukharin's solution was the new economic policy. It was a mixed system encouraging private enterprise on a small scale, but nationalizing major industries. To some, it was a sellout. The communist revolution had been hard won, and they were reluctant to see a semi-capitalist system installed. Others, notably Lenin, were impressed by its realistic approach. The full conversion, Lenin insisted, would not happen overnight, and compromise was essential. The new economic policy was introduced in 1921, and Bukharin's popularity soared. On Christmas Day, 1922, Lenin wrote of Bukharin, "He is not only the most valuable theoretician of the party, but is the favourite of us all." But by now, Lenin was terminally ill. Bukharin was his closest confidant and visited him almost daily. As editor of Pravda, the party newspaper, Bukharin was able to voice Lenin's policies and communicate his last instructions. The Russian writer, Anatoly Rybakov, clearly remembers the uncertainty over who would be chosen to succeed Lenin.
Before his death, Lenin, realizing that the leadership of the party and country was a very important question, wrote a letter to the party congress on the subject of the new leadership. He produced testimonials for the 6 main figures in the party: Trotsky, Stalin, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin and Pyatakov, noting the strong and weak points of each. He mentioned the weak points to indicate that one leader could not emerge from them, and that they should all comprise some kind of collective leadership. He proposed the removal of only one person, Stalin. You see, although he called Stalin one of the major leaders of the party, it was Stalin alone he proposed removing. He realized that Stalin would be an obstacle on the path which he, Lenin, had envisaged.
Lenin died on January the 21st, 1924. His coffin was brought from Gorky to Moscow by train, and Bukharin helped carry it through the streets. To lose their leader only 6 years after the revolution came as a devastating blow to the Russian people. As Lenin's body was guarded by his potential successors, none could accurately predict the country's future, except perhaps one man. Lenin had anticipated this. In his personal behavior, Stalin is too coarse. He has accumulated great power, and I'm not sure he will know how to use it wisely. 3 years of internal party squabbles wrecked the collective leadership. Allying himself with Bukharin, Stalin stood in the wings. But once he had emerged as supreme leader, this partnership was threatened.
Stalin believed that recalcitrant peasants, all intellectuals who disagreed with him, should be eliminated physically, and this he did in the course of the 1930s. This was in utter contrast to Bukharin's much more tolerant approach to intellectual division of opinion. Bukharin, being himself a convinced Marxist, a considerable intellect, and a man of great intellectual self-confidence, believed he could persuade all those who disagreed with him over to his point of view.
Professor Dmitry Volkogonov has just published the first official critical Soviet biography of Stalin.
I would say that prior to 1928, relations between Stalin and Bukharin were almost comradely. If one could say and imply by the word almost, that Stalin ever had any real comrades. This man was incapable of feeling such human values as comradeship and friendship. He was a pragmatist, and one could define friendship and comradeship only where it was of advantage to him. Up until 1928, they called each other T. He called Stalin Koba, and Stalin called Bukharin Nikolai. And I would even say that after Lenin's death, when Bukharin became a member of the Politburo, they had a kind of division of labor. Stalin was the organizer, the head, whereas Bukharin was the theorist. And Stalin did not hide the fact that he always valued Bukharin the theorist, but only for as long as it suited him.
During this period, Bukharin was supported by his third wife, Anna Larina, who was 25 years his junior and had grown up alongside him.
Well, I met him. Actually, the word met isn't the right one in the circumstances, because he was a great friend of my father's, and I simply grew up under his eyes. We lived in the same house. It's now the Metropole Hotel. When the capital was transferred from Petrograd to Moscow in March 1918, we were all housed in hotels. And Nikolai Ivanovich and Larin, my father, lived in the Metropole. They had flats above one another and met very often. So I got to know Nikolai Ivanovich. I was attracted by his vitality, his love of nature. I found his character so childish, and I didn't even regard him as a grown-up person. It felt as if he were the same age as me. He had all sorts of little animals in the Metropole, living at the end of the corridor. Our rooms were situated at the end of a corridor and were partitioned off by a fountain. But the fountain hadn't worked since the revolution, and he set up a menagerie there. He had a monkey and a bear cub living there. And that's how I was charmed. I wrote him a poem and dedicated it to him. The last lines were... I can't even remember them now. They went something like, I am always sad without you. I can't live. Something along those lines. I have them written down. And I wanted to pass them on to him, but I was embarrassed to go. I was just a young girl. But my father said, let me write on the envelope that it's from me, and you take it. I merely had to go downstairs. And I met Stalin on the stairs and handed over the letter to give to Bukharin. And that was my first declaration of love.
It took Bukharin many years, at least until the late 20s, to wake up to the danger to all the original idealism of Bolshevism that Stalin and his Stalinist followers would provide. He's very naive here, and it doesn't seem to be until almost the last moment when Stalin reveals his hand and insists on the use of violence against the peasantry that Bukharin sees the alarm signals. And by then, of course, it's too late. This stems directly from his very trusting nature, and it's quite extraordinary that even in political defeat by Stalin, which was effected by 1929, Bukharin seems not to hold a grudge against Stalin personally. They remain on rather intimate terms, in the sense that they live in adjoining flats in the Kremlin, and when Stalin's wife commits suicide at the end of 1932, in circumstances that are still yet unexplained, but which were clearly a strong blow to Stalin personally, Stalin proposes that he and Bukharin swap apartments so that he would no longer need to live in this bloodthirsty bedroom. They used to go on picnics together in the best Russian manner and strip to the waist and engage in wrestling matches, which Bukharin always won, a fact that Stalin may well have held against him later.
In 1929, Stalin threw out Bukharin's new economic policy and implemented a brutal plan designed to convert Russia from an agrarian society to a superpower in just 10 years. A vast transformation of the countryside took place. The Dnieper Dam, then the largest dam in the world, was constructed, followed by thousands of miles of railway tracks connecting the remotest corners of the country to the centres of power. Heroic, even impossible targets were met, utilising massive manpower. Glorious triumphs, Stalin's reign of terror was just beginning.
Я многого не знал, естественно, но я видел,
I could see, there was a lot I didn't know, of course, but I could see how that man, gradually discarding opponents and setting one group on another, came to take personal power within the country. Of course, the atmosphere in the 1930s was on the one hand construction and the enthusiasm of people, and he knew how to provide young people with slogans. Songs were written, music composed, films made, theatre. Everything was at work. It was a vast propaganda machine that praised him and all his doings. And it was, of course, very difficult to oppose that propaganda machine. The people believed that this was as it had to be. Do you see? Believed in Stalin, in what he was doing, and the cause of socialism. And on the other hand, there was terror. The fear of saying a wrong word, since you could suffer for a single wrong word.
Stalin had grown to hate the kulaks, the rich peasants who had profiteered under Bukharin. In a fit of revenge, he stripped them of their wealth and transported over 3 million to their deaths. This dismantling of the countryside led to widespread famine. Bukharin witnessed the tragedy at first hand, and as Anna recalls, it devastated him.
He used to go to the Crimea and see the starving children with swollen tummies, and used to come to my father and relate it all. And he even burst out crying. It was a terrible episode. He was most upset by it.
But he wept in silence, so to speak, in his own home. We cannot possibly quote him as saying in any public place what he thought of it. I should imagine he was dismayed. But to interpret Bukharin, one must remember that he was a loyal member of the party. And Stalin played on that. In a difficult and dangerous world, Hitler coming to power in Germany, also in the same year, 1933, was this the time to rock the boat? And I think Bukharin kept silent not only because the secret police was hovering on the doorstep, but because he felt it his duty to keep silent.
Inside the British Embassy, Fitzroy MacLean watched Stalin's terror gathering momentum.
At that time, nobody was safe. High officials, high party officials, government officials, marshals, generals, admirals, people who'd given the whole of their lives to the Soviet cause simply disappeared overnight. And of course, it was also a time of delation. People denounced each other. If you wanted somebody's job or his wife or even his flat, you denounced him as a Japanese or German or British spy, and he was wheeled away. Horrible atmosphere. You could see people shivering in their shoes.
One child whose life was profoundly affected by the terror was Engelsina Chekova. Aged 7, she attended one of Stalin's meetings in 1936 with her father, a minor party official from Serbia.
I felt awfully bored. I was sitting there with a huge bunch of flowers, 2 of them. Then I got fed up. Here's a photo of all the delegates. And during one of the speeches, I just got up and started off towards the platform. Stalin turned round and picked me up. That's the moment they printed the photo of. I thought I was the happiest girl in the whole country. Because when I came downstairs to the hotel lobby the next day, I saw that all the papers had my photo in them. A little girl and Stalin. Literally all the papers. And I was very proud of that. And told everyone, you know, that's my picture. It's me, it's me. And people started to invite me to visit them, people who lived in the hotel. And they gave me all sorts of presents because I had become very, very famous. I had become the symbol of happy childhood.
A sculpture of Engelsine entitled "Thank you, Comrade Stalin, for my happy childhood" was erected in Moscow. It has since been pulled down. On December the 11th, 1937, Engelsine's father disappeared.
That was shattering, of course, because after such a placid life, I suddenly found myself the daughter of an enemy of the people. Naturally, we wrote Stalin a letter, because we certainly didn't link my father's arrest with Stalin. Well, the response to the letter we sent to Stalin, that's to say, I wrote it and my mother dictated it, was the arrest of my mother.
Engelsine never saw her father again, and her mother died in exile in Turkestan.
Of course, nobody in the history of man had ever wielded the power that Stalin wielded. Tolstoy once said, 30 or 40 years before, imagine Genghis Khan with a telephone. And that really summed it up remarkably well.
By now, Bukharin was editor of Izvestia, the government newspaper. In a surprise move in 1936, Stalin sent him with Anna, then 8 months pregnant, to Paris, ostensibly to collect party archive.
A small footnote, but I think an interesting one, that in a play recently playing in Moscow, Bukharin and Stalin both appear, as the actors playing them both appear, and Bukharin, so to speak, posthumously on stage complains he was shot in 1938, to which Stalin on stage says, but Nikolai, I let you go to Paris in 1936, why did you return? It's a nice question, why did he? I'm sure he knew what fate awaited him.
Nikolai Ivanovich at that time just didn't have an inkling. No. I think he still wouldn't have believed. He would have returned just the same. Just the same. He wasn't like that. He would have returned just the same in order to have his say, to put his case. For example, he was in the Pamirs and went down by chance to the town of Frunze, and there he learned from the papers about Zinoviev's trial. And the day that the sentence was carried out, he sent a telegram to Stalin to postpone the carrying out of the sentence on Zinoviev in order to have a confrontation. He thought he could put Zinoviev's case in some way. Well, now we think in completely different terms. We think that they had some sort of idea. Of course they knew what Stalin was, but not to such an extent.
Nikolai Bukharin was arrested on the 27th of February 1937. He spent over a year in prison awaiting trial. During that time he was tortured and forced to confess to being a traitor and plotting to murder Lenin. Fitzroy MacLean was just 27 years old when he attended the trial on March the 3rd, 1938.
I sat listening to the speeches, taking notes, and in the intervals I did that 10 hours a day for 10 days. Very exhausting, especially as it went on to 2 or 3 in the morning quite often. In those days, Stalin liked staying up late, and he kept the whole country up late too. This is where that extraordinary trial was held. Before the revolution, it had been the ballroom of the Nobles Club. Now it was filled with a carefully selected audience of party members, come here to be thrilled, to be edified, but in the ultimate analysis, to be scared and to be warned. It was quite easy to recognize Bukharin. He looked, for one thing, much more of an intellectual than the others did. His intelligence shone out from his eyes. And then he had a palish complexion, and he had a little beard that made him look a little like his friend Lenin. There was also, of course, Rykov, who had been at one stage Lenin's successor. Then there was Kristinsky, who equally had been very important in the early days of the revolution, and who recently had been Deputy Commissar for Foreign Affairs, and who, you know, one had met at embassy parties and that sort of thing. Finally, there was Yagoda, the enormously sinister former head of the secret police, who had probably mounted the whole trial himself, only to find himself popped into the dock along with the people he was accusing. At the beginning of the trial, of course, people were relaxed and waving to their friends and laughing and talking. But once it started, there was an atmosphere of pretty good tension, because after all, these men were being tried for their lives. One of the things that sticks in my memory is how fit and smart the special security guards looked guarding the dock, and how comparatively grey and seedy the prisoners looked. When the prisoners came in, there was a gasp of horror at the mere thought that such horrible people should exist. They were charged with every conceivable crime in the calendar, with having tried to murder Lenin, tried to overthrow the government, sabotage the economy, sabotaged agriculture, contacts with every secret service in the world, every foreign espionage organization, and so on, and crimes going right back to 1905, to long before the revolution.
The prosecution case was led by Andrei Vyshinsky. Later on, Stalin promoted him to foreign minister. A series of articles damning Vyshinsky's role in the trial were recently published by the Russian writer Arkady Vaksberg.
Его средство была брань.
His method was abuse, bad language. When you read his speeches now, you are struck by the vocabulary of this professor who subsequently became an academic. He didn't take the trouble to construct a case. He paid little attention to evidence. But on the other hand, he had a good knowledge of the range of abusive language. His favorite expressions were filthy dogs, demented bitches, diseased lice, etc. It would be impossible to list them all now. The most remarkable thing is that this language got through. It worked. It made an impression instead of evidence.
Они готовят открыть фронт нашей страны. Они готовят открыть границы нашей страны. Они готовы открыть широко ворота иностранному завоевателю. Но они хотят изобразить это дело так, как будто это черное дело каких-то иных, чужих рук, против которых они, видите ли, вот эти вот иезуиты и фарисеи, эти иуды Искариоты и Василий Шуйский поднимают теперь свой голос подлинного советского патриотизма. Игра разоблачена. Маска предательства с их облика, с их лиц сорвана. И сорвана раз и навсегда.
Vyshinsky was a particularly unpleasant phenomenon because his own political past, which everybody was digging into, wasn't too clear. He'd been a Menshevik until 2 or 3 years after the revolution, and that was not a healthy thing to have been. He also was second-rate in most ways, but a yes man through and through. And what was unpleasant, particularly unpleasant, was that he was obviously frightened himself. After all, amongst the prisoners was Jagoda, who 18 months or so before had been supremely powerful as head of the secret police. Now he was in the dock, and if he could be in the dock, Вышинский knew perfectly well that he could be in the dock too if he put a foot wrong.
Теперь я думаю, ясно для всех, что нынешние вредители-диверсанты, каким бы флагом они ни маскировались, троцкистским или бухаринским, давно уже перестали быть политическим течением в рабочем движении, что они превратились в беспринципную и безидейную банду профессиональных вредителей, диверсантов, шпионов, убийц. Понятно, что этих господ придется громить и корчевать беспощадно.
Bukharin conducted himself with great dignity. He was, of course, immensely superior to anyone else there in character, moral character, intellect, and everything else. He had been one of the makers of the revolution, and he'd been a close friend of Lenin's, and he'd been a gold medalist at the university. He also knew the outside world in a way that people like Stalin didn't. And for all those reasons, in spite of his terrible predicament that he was in, and he knew perfectly well that he wouldn't come out of this alive, he did manage to dominate the proceedings in the most extraordinary way, rather to the discomfiture of Vyshinsky and the judges. The proceedings were filmed right through, as far as I remember. They had these up by the dock. They had these arc lights and movie cameras. And there was one extraordinary episode during the trial when the man, poor man who was operating the arc lights, let it get out of control. And it shot right up and through its beam of light onto that little middle window up there. And through the dark glass, we could recognize the features of Stalin gloating over his former colleagues. It was very dramatic indeed.
Bukharin at the trial did what he could. And if you read what he did try and say at the trial, one must bear in mind he had recently got married, he had a baby, both his widow and the then baby are still alive, and they wouldn't have been, I'm sure the point was made perfectly clear to him, if he didn't in fact plead guilty. But he started pleading guilty in a very peculiar way, and yes, of course, he was an enemy, but no, he didn't try and overthrow Lenin. There are certain accusations which he denied, and even the ones he admitted in such a way that, if you look at it carefully, I think he is telling the subsequent generations that one mustn't really believe it. Vyshinsky, who was the prosecuting counsel, and, if I may say so, a bastard of the first water, was a little upset by the kind of answers he got. I mean, it's really a matter of somebody whose hands are bound behind his back. He's half-gagged, having to say something. In the circumstances, who are we to criticize what he did?
Well, he was sentenced to death as he was bound to be sentenced to death, and as he and everybody else knew before the trial began that he was bound to be. My own reaction was that was what was bound to happen in these circumstances. But of course what shocked me and what left really a horrendous impression was, after listening to this 10 hours a day for 10 days, one was stunned by it. One went away with the horror that it should be possible to manipulate human beings in that way, intelligent human beings, and get them to go through these antics.
By 1939, Stalin had personally signed 40,000 death warrants, eliminating men, women and children in an attempt to purge the country of the old Bolshevik revolutionaries.
Со мной случилось до смерти.
What happened to me before his death, before the sentence? Yes, Nikolai Ivanovich was arrested on the 27th of February, and he had not yet been condemned when I was banished from Moscow to Astrakhan. A decision was sent there, allegedly sentencing me to 5 years' exile. But I was arrested again 3 months later. The wives of military men were also sent into exile there. In fact, we were exiled the very same day of the trial against Tukhachevsky, Yakir Ruborevich and others. And everyone was rearrested there and given 8 years in the camps. And I did my 8 years.
Anna spent a total of 20 years in camps. Separated from her baby, she did not see him again until he was 21. Stalin's reputation remained divorced from the terror until after his death in 1953. Such was his effect on ordinary people that no one realized what he had done.
Of course we didn't understand, because the Stalin cult was so strong, and he'd entered the people's flesh and blood to such an extent that, well, it was as if he'd become part of them, like a cancer growing inside the body. I had an 8-month-old daughter, and when I heard that Stalin was dead, I cried. I held her in my arms and I cried, because I was thinking, oh my God, she'll never see Stalin alive now. And I was sorry about that.
Literally just a few days before his arrest, and Bukharin still had a government network telephone. He was the editor of a major paper. He telephoned Stalin using the government network telephone and said, "Koba, do you really believe that I am an enemy?" And Stalin said to him, "Nikolai, calm down. We'll get to the bottom of things and everything will be okay." And he replaced the receiver. That is to say, he was a very great hypocrite. He was an actor writ large. He could present himself in one role during the Politburo sessions, in another in addressing the people, and in yet another when dealing with military commanders. He was an actor, and Bukharin was a victim of his.
Oh dear, he wrote him endless letters, proving his innocence and addressing him as Dear Koba. I don't know, but it's hard to say. But all the same, I think that he realized what he was worth. It's hard for me to say, because by then he was psychologically unbalanced. And I can't say that he was, by this time, a person in full command of his mind. Perhaps later, in prison, it all subsided. But here he was very agitated, and it was as though a straitjacket had been put on his brain. It's very difficult to explain psychologically, very difficult. Because so much had landed on him, and on top of it all, a young wife and son who was virtually newborn when he was 10 months old. And all of this together had a terrible effect on him. It's a difficult question, but I don't think he thought well of Stalin by then.
Anna's role in this story is fundamental, and its essence is that in the hours before his arrest in 1937, Bukharin wrote down and then subsequently destroyed a text dedicated to the future generation of party members. He insisted that she memorized it, which she did, and in 1961, herself having had almost a quarter of a century in Soviet prisons and labor camps, she was called in to a Khrushchev party commission investigating the Bukharin case and announced its existence.
I depart this life and bow my head. I feel my helplessness in the face of a hellish machine which, using no doubt the methods of the medieval ages, possesses gigantic force, fabricates organized slander, and operates boldly and confidently. I have been in the party since the age of 18, and the aim of my life has always been the struggle for the interests of the working class and the victory of socialism. During these days, the newspaper with the sacred name Pravda, Truth, has been printing the most vile lie. That supposedly I, Nikolai Bukharin, wanted to destroy the achievements of the October Revolution and restore capitalism. I appeal to all members of the party in these, possibly the last days of my life. And I am convinced that the filter of history will, sooner or later, inevitably cleanse the dirt from my head. I would unhesitatingly have given my own life for the life of Lenin, and I organized nothing against. Request the new, young and honest generation of party leaders to read out my letter at a plenum of the Central Committee, vindicate me and reinstate me in the party. Comrades, know that on the banner which you will bear along the triumphant procession towards communism, there is also a drop of my blood.
I'm always amazed by the continuity of Russian history. Mr. Gorbachev has said that you can't understand Russia today unless you know her history, and I think that's very true. Over the centuries, Russia has been blessed, if that's the word, with a series of rulers who felt that it was their duty or their inclination to drag their country and people kicking and screaming into the next century. Ivan the Terrible, first of all, then Peter the Great, and then Stalin. And in many ways they all resembled each other, and so did their methods, which were very rough indeed.
The rehabilitation of Bukharin was started last year when a committee headed by Judge Marov examined 100 volumes of evidence from the trial. They concluded there had been a total arbitrariness and total disregard for the law. The process of rehabilitation was threefold: judicial, academic, and political. In February 1988, Bukharin's sentence was annulled. In May, his name was restored to the Academy, and in June he was posthumously reinstated to the party. But it had taken 50 years to clear his name.
I think the main reason for that is that the history of the party hitherto has always presented the whole Stalin period as basically a good thing, except that Stalin killed too many people. But Bukharin and many of these other characters had disagreed on important elements of the party line. And it seemed, from the point of view of the infallibility of the party, difficult to rehabilitate them without putting into question a large segment of Soviet history and even the infallibility of the party. Well, now we have, under Gorbachev, the party leaders saying, well, leader saying, and saying frequently, that they're not infallible, that this is a totally new atmosphere in which you can look differently at Soviet history and indeed at the Soviet present.
Hundreds of names have now been restored in a massive attempt to recognize and redress the past. As mass graves are being discovered outside Moscow, a vast memorial to those who perished under Stalin's rule is now being planned. But it is the restoration of Bukharin that has had the most impact.
Gorbachev is the first intellectual in the Politburo since Bukharin, given that over the intervening 50 years one had, first of all, the Stalinists who were not interested in independent ideas, and non-intellectuals such as Khrushchev. The similarities between Bukharin and Gorbachev are most compelling. They have the same supporters. Both appealed quite directly to an educated intelligentsia and to the population at large that wishes to be active in advancing itself economically, whether peasants or workers, in order to assist the economy as a whole. Moreover, they share the same enemies. Bukharin's great warning against the creation of a central state apparatus, which he knew Stalinism would bring, is precisely the same body of opinion and officials which Gorbachev is at present trying to reduce. Therefore, the past closely relates to the present. Hence, the great interest amongst Gorbachev and the Soviet population in Bukharin's ideas.
If a nation wants to go forward, it must know its own history. So, of course, it's a difficult operation. It is hard for many people to remember everything that happened, because people lived then. They believed in something. They had work to do. They believed in Stalin, and many were in the army. So it's all very difficult. And they did not put up resistance against Stalin, against the terror. They did not protect the innocent. And it's hard to remember that. But without it, we cannot go forward. We must free ourselves from Stalin's legacy.
Он не был властолюбивым и не хотел.
Nikolai Ivanovich was not a lover of power, and he did not want that. He used to talk about it to me all the time, about how history would vindicate him, that annoying mistakes happen in history, but that in one way or another the filter of history would, as he wrote, cleanse the dirt from his head, and that I was young, and that I would live to see it.
Raised by the youth